Hey y'all, welcome to the channel. Today we're checking out why was Churchill voted out of office after World War II? Short animated documentary. Question mark.
When you lead a country to victory in a major war and maintain great popularity throughout, it would seem unlikely that you'd immediately be voted out of office.
Yeah.
But this is what happened to Winston Churchill in the wake of World War II, who,
Okay.
despite being very popular, lost an election in 1945 just before Japan's surrender. Which raises the question, why? Why was Churchill kicked out of power just after winning the Second World War?
Yeah, so I didn't know this happened. I just learned about this from seeing the title of the video. He's like the most iconic British person of the 20th century. Maybe other than the Queen, right? Winston Churchill. I reacted to a video about him a few months ago, and I learned some crazy stuff about him. He was kind of psychic. He had premonitions. He was a prisoner, and he escaped. He was a really exceptional person. You all probably already know that. I just knew him as a grumpy old British guy telling people what to do, but he was actually a lot more than that. He probably has the longest Wikipedia page I've ever seen. Let's read this fictional newspaper. The Daily News, July 27th, 1945, 1 Labour wins, Churchill out as Britain demands radical change. Snagudawigolaranawana. Churchill said that, apparently. Socialists control Parliament. The Conservative Party has received a body blow as the British people have kicked them out of Parliament and given the Labour Party a crushing majority. Churchill was said to be drunkened by the news and preparing his exit from Downing Street. The incoming Prime Minister, Mr. Attlee, has promised again not to create a British Gestapo and that he primarily just wants to build houses and fight commies. He says that he'll do his best until the next election, where he intends to win the popular vote but still lose to Churchill. Allies ask Japan to surrender. The Allied command have once again made a formal request for Japan to surrender. General MacArthur said to reporters, "We've already won. You know it, we know it. Why are we still doing this? I want to run for president and you're making this difficult because you keep shooting back." The Japanese government responded that it would never surrender unless a mega weapon was used against them at least twice, and at the same time another major front opened, and since that was never going to occur, the war would be eternal. Bright flash in Nevada is nothing. Stop asking. What? In a press release, the Truman administration has responded to questions surrounding a very bright flash which occurred in the Nevada desert a few weeks ago. It's nothing, probably just a bulb exploding. Stop asking, or else, said the president, when asked about the totally natural phenomena. Truman went on to remind the press that so little happened in the area in question, it would be fatally boring to go there. And so none of you must ever visit. They tested the bomb back then, I bet. July 16th, 1945. So it would have been just a few days before this. July 27th, 1945.
Well, when Germany surrendered in 1945, the British government was governed by both the Conservative and Labour parties, which had formed a coalition after elections were suspended in 1940 for the duration of the war. This suspension was to last until the threat to the British mainland was gone, and when it was, the Labour Party withdrew from the coalition. Elections were scheduled for early July, and so both sides immediately started drawing up manifestos to put to the people.
Okay, during the war, they didn't have elections, which is probably smart. You don't want to be dealing with that while you're getting bombed, right? The Labour Party withdrew from what now? Why did the Labour Party withdraw from the coalition? The only thing I found is that they were preparing for an election, so they withdrew.
The Conservative plan was simple. Churchill. He was seen as the face of British victory over Germany, and the Conservative Party focused on his foreign policy credentials as being able to secure the empire and also give Britain an enhanced position within the new world that was emerging.
That seems logical. Yeah, you have Winston Churchill as your candidate, and he's the incumbent. Yeah, you would think that would be enough, right? Cult of personality, he's a charming guy, seems like he always knows exactly what to say. His only downfall was that he was a conservative, not to get political. And these posters say he beat Hitler entirely on his own. That's not true, but it's the marketing.
And the Conservative Party focused on his foreign policy credentials as being able to secure the empire and also give Britain an enhanced position within the new world that was emerging. Beyond this, Churchill's plans for Britain were a part of what were known as the 4-year plan. This was co-authored by both parties and it promised the creation of a national health service funded by a new national insurance tax, the expansion of agricultural production to reduce food imports, and the rebuilding of the country after all those bombs had been dropped on it. Whereas the Labour Party also promised the creation of a national health service, the rebuilding of the country, the expansion of educational opportunities, but importantly they also promised to massively reduce unemployment, which was especially important given how many soldiers were returning home.
Okay, that's a big one. Both sides were promising to rebuild the country, the infrastructure, everything that got bombed, healthcare, grow more food, but the Labour Party promised to enhance education and employment. Did that sign say full employment? How does that work? How do you do that? Some people don't want to work, like me.
So why did Labour win when their policies were so similar? Well, whilst Churchill was very popular, he was seen as a great wartime leader and not a peacetime one. Throughout the coalition, the Labour Party hadn't been in charge of running the war, but running Britain domestically, and the people had seen them as being quite good at it. They had also importantly joined the government in 1940, and so they weren't tarnished by the failure of appeasement like the Conservatives were.
So during the war, Winston was dealing with the war, but at home, the Labour Party was doing the nitty-gritty of government, right? The nitty-gritty.
Throughout the coalition, the Labour Party hadn't been in charge of running the war, but running Britain domestically, and the people had seen them as being quite good at it. They had also importantly joined the government in 1940, and so they weren't tarnished by the failure of appeasement like the Conservatives were. Also, broadly, the British people wanted radical change.
Tarnished by appeasement. So there was a time when the Conservatives were trying to appease Hitler? British Conservatives appease. How Britain hoped to avoid war with Germany in the 1930s. Instituted in the hope of avoiding war, appeasement was the name given to Britain's policy in the 1930s of allowing Hitler to expand German territory unchecked. So it wasn't even Winston Churchill, it was this Neville Chamberlain guy. Great name for a British person, I have to say. Neville Chamberlain. That's a British name. Only thing that can make that more British is if it was Nigel Chamberlain. So appeasement is now widely discredited as a policy of weakness, yet at the time it was a popular and seemingly pragmatic policy. Yeah, nobody wants to go to war. I mean, some people do want to go to war, but they didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know about the Holocaust and all the horrible things Hitler was doing, really. So they just thought he wanted, this is giving me Russia-Ukraine vibes. Yep, Russia-Ukraine vibes. Hitler's expansionist aims became clear in 1936. Neville Chamberlain seemed to have averted war by agreeing that Germany could occupy the the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia. This became known as Munich Agreement, the Munich Agreement. In Britain, the Munich Agreement was greeted with jubilation. However, Churchill then estranged from the government and one of the few to oppose appeasement of Hitler. So Churchill didn't like appeasement, and yet whenever he was running for re-election, he got blamed for it, it looks like. Appeasement was popular because Chamberlain and the British people were desperate to avoid the slaughter of another war. Yeah, World War I probably seemed like it just ended. Britain was overstretched policing the empire and could not afford major rearmament. I read that as rearmament. Its main ally, France, was seriously weakened, and unlike in the First World War, Commonwealth support was not a certainty. Many Britons also sympathized with Germany, which they felt had been treated unfairly following its defeat in 1918. Wow, appeasement. Okay, it was unpopular.
Of appeasement like the Conservatives were. Also, broadly, the British people wanted radical change. You see, the war kind of sucked, and so people wanted to build a much better system after its end. Many of them felt that Churchill and his colleagues wouldn't do that in the same way that Labour leader Clement Attlee would.
Change.
Churchill also made the mistake of thinking that the British people hated all things socialist like they had done in the past.
Change is always a winning manifesto. That's how Barack Obama won. That's how most politicians win, it seems like. So then Winston thought people hated socialism, but they didn't necessarily. I wonder what made him think that. Like, why was he off? Because he seemed to have his finger on the pulse of the culture pretty well. Why did he make that mistake? Oh, Winston Churchill said socialism is the philosophy of failure. I mean, maybe it is. I don't know. This quotation is now going around the web attributed to Churchill. Is it accurate? Socialism is the blah, 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 blah. Doesn't say why. We're just going to have to know that he did.
Churchill also made the mistake of thinking that the British people hated all things socialist like they had done in the past, since it was no longer associated primarily with revolution and killing monarchs. It was now seen as a vital part of Germany's defeat, and people like Joseph Stalin maintained great popularity in the UK. And as such, when Churchill said that a Labour victory would lead to a new Gestapo in Britain, it hurt his electoral chances. And throughout the campaign...
Hang on, what? It's going by so fast.
Since it was no longer associated primarily with revolution and killing monarchs. It was now seen as a vital part of Germany's defeat, and people...
Okay, so the people didn't like socialism because it was associated with killing? Is that what they're saying?
Since it was no longer associated primarily with revolution and killing monarchs. It was now seen as a vital part of Germany's defeat, and people like Joseph Stalin maintained great popularity in the UK.
What? Joseph Stalin was popular in the UK? That's Joseph Stalin? Look at that hair. Yo, Joseph Stalin had awesome hair. Look at that. Amazing hair. Okay, because he helped defeat the Nazis. That makes sense. He just seems like a bad guy to me. But he was our ally in World War II, right? He died of a stroke in 1953. But he was a murderous dictator. Oh, and then Khrushchev denounced Stalin. What a tangled web we weave, y'all. Crazy.
And as such, when Churchill said that a Labour victory would lead to a new Gestapo in Britain, it hurt his electoral chances. And throughout the campaign, the Conservatives made no attempt to change course, despite polling 20 points behind the Labour Party for the entire thing. So why didn't they change? Well, it was simple. They didn't believe the polls. And when the election was over, Conservative leaders were shocked to find out that not only had they lost, they'd suffered the greatest upset in their party's history.
Wow.
And thus, despite his immense popularity with the British people, Churchill was kicked out of office just after World War II.
That's crazy.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. And
that's really surprising. But then he was re-elected. So then in 1951, Churchill again became prime minister, remaining in office until his resignation in 1955. He had several minor strokes. King George VI was going to ask him to resign, but King George VI died before it happened, before he could ask him to. And then in 1953, he had another stroke and he became paralyzed down one side. It was kept secret until he recovered. Queen Elizabeth II offered to create Churchill Duke of London, but he declined because of the objections of his son Randolph, who would have inherited the title on his father's death. He didn't want it? That would be an amazing title. Duke of London? Is there a Duke of London? Oh, proposed dukedom. Dukedom. Great word. He finally died in 1965, so he knew about the Beatles. That's crazy. Churchill always self-confidently believed himself to be a man of destiny. Because of this, he lacked restraint and could be reckless. His self-belief manifested in his affinity with war, of which, according to Sebastian blah blah blah, he exhibited a profound and innate understanding. For war, Churchill considered himself a military genius, but that made him vulnerable to failure. It's really strange looking back on history, and Winston Churchill is this huge figure. I guess since that time, he's become even more ingrained in British culture, and he's become even more of almost like a legend or a mythological person. And it's really strange to think of him losing an election, you know? Oh, this was interesting. I'm impressed that he came back and won after that, you know? Most people would just let it lie, don't run again, but he did, and he won. He was a survivor. He was a fighter, for better or worse. Really interesting video. Thank y'all for watching this with me, and I'll see y'all next time. Later.